Hi everyone and welcome back to Behind the Cycle. This is Phil Quinn, your host. But this week we're not going to be doing the same kind of episode we've done to date. Instead, I've conducted a single interview with former Labour Minister, long-term MP from the Hawke's Bay region, a friend of mine since the early 90s, the great, the legendary, the occasionally loquacious Rick Barker. Now, I'm not just getting Rick on to spin yarns, although I can assure you, among the many great yarn spinners produced by New Zealand politics, he's among the best of them. No, I've asked Rick to come on to help us with a kind of level setting exercise. I've asked him to do his best to explain to this audience, people like you, people like me, go back to the basics of how we function as a democracy, with a particular focus on that bastion of combat in a political setting, and that is, of course, question time. Now, a lot of people criticise question time, see it as a sideshow. They talk a lot, I've heard a lot of people talk about how childish they consider the behaviour in the chamber to be, how much disgrace it brings upon the country. I've never really agreed with that. I've been in and around parliaments, at least for the first half of my career, constantly. Starting in New Zealand, in the Victorian State Parliament, and in the Australian Federal Parliament. And I take a great interest in how other parliaments around the world operate too. It's an arena I enjoy, and the combat is part of the fun. But it also serves a more serious purpose around the fundamental, indispensable role of Parliament in holding the executive under our Westminster system to account, and question time, and the various other rules and entitlements and responsibilities around asking questions in a variety of ways, be it written, oral, or via the select committee process. These are the mechanisms of enforcing democratic accountability. They're really important. It's important, I think, to go back to basics and understand how our question time in particular has evolved over time, and how that evolution was accelerated by the introduction of MMP, and how, at least in Rick Barker's telling, the post-MMP changes have made New Zealand's particular version of the Westminster style question time the most robust, and for ministers at least, the most challenging of all. And he puts that alongside Australia, even the UK with its famous Prime Minister's question time. He makes a pretty good argument. It's a 40-minute interview. This is not clickbait. This reflects, I think, the values of this podcast, which is we're going to be a bit boring, we're going to go a bit deep, but we think you'll get used to it and you might even come to like it. And Rick knows how to tell a story even when the content's a bit like fourth form social studies. Nonetheless, if you're listening to this on podcast, there is a YouTube video version, and I only mention that because I did stretch my video editing skills to and beyond breaking point in order to spice up the video and help add some features that I think will make this Rick Barker discourse more cohesive, easy to follow, and as educative and informative and insightful as I certainly found it when I was with Rick in person. We'll come back with a more typical episode in the coming days. A lot's happened. The tragic passing of Efeso Collins, who is such a loss, well, you can never say irreplaceable, but such a singular, such an essential voice in our national discourse. We'll be reflecting on his legacy in the next episode with guests and co-hosts who have a deep personal connection there. And we might also have, as our newsmaker guest, someone on our side of the chamber who's enjoyed a pretty significant promotion in the last couple of days. Not saying any names, but you might be able to work it out. In the meantime, please enjoy this. Rick Barker on why New Zealand's Question Time is the best of its kind.
Well, Question Time starts from one of the two rights of and obligations of a parliamentarian. The first one as a parliamentarian is to be a representative and therefore to speak on behalf of or speak in terms of their own views on these things. The other thing the parliamentarian has is the right to ask questions, to ask questions. And in one context, the right to ask questions comes in three forms: oral questions at the House sits, written questions to ministers, any questions during the parliamentary select committee process. Questions are a really important part of the role, and it's quite a skill to get the right question, because if you don't have the right question, you're not going to get the right answer. And people will look at the questions in multiple ways. So writing the question is a very important skill of a politician, so that they make sure they get to the point of what they want.
What does a good question look like? What are the elements of an effective?
Well, we'll come back to that if you don't mind. Let's just go through. So we've got that, and the New Zealand Parliament is different. It follows the Westminster system. It's different from the US and a lot of others, where the executive, that's the people who actually run the arms of the state, come from parliamentarians. In America, for example, the president is the executive arm, and the president appoints who his cabinet ministers are, and they're not directly linked to Congress, the Senate or the House of Representatives. So there's a sort of quite a division there. And for the Senate or the House of Representatives in the states to hold the cabinet ministers to account, they need to have an inquiry. But in New Zealand, because they are parliamentarians, then they are in the government benches on the government side, in the front benches over there, and a certain part of the House are all located there. And Question Time is for the rest of Parliament, that's all backbench MPs, to be able to ask questions of the executive to hold them to account. And questions in the House in New Zealand are divided proportionally, and they're divided amongst those people who are not members of the executive, so that the government, when they appoint 20 or 22 ministers, those numbers are taken out and the portion then is amongst the remaining 100. So because of that, you'll find that questions will be allocated more to opposition parties than they will be to government parties. So you then have government and opposition parties. And the government parties are likely to ask questions which are helpful to ministers or could be unhelpful to the opposition. But the opposition parties are looking to probe the government to test whether or not it's on its mettle, whether it's done things correctly, and whether there are any snafus here. And also to test their thinking when there are serious issues of the day. So Question Time is a fundamental part of our democracy, and it's a really important part, and sadly is a little bit misunderstood. The House is a debating chamber. It is not a lecture theatre or a school classroom. So there's quite a lot of rambunctiousness about it. And it's theatre as well, because people want to make their points very often in a theatrical way. The theatre is also to test the strength of the government of the day. So let's start with government questions. The government questions come in two forms. One is to make ministers will ask backbench MPs of their own party to ask questions of them, which make them look good. So a classic is to the Minister of Tourism, how many does he have any update on the number of tourists visiting New Zealand? And of course the Minister will answer, well, yes, I do, just happen to have to hand it. The latest statistics show there's been an uptick of 5% or more, as if he personally or she personally has ensured that they will be here. It's to them. Opposition parties quite often wave these questions away, or probably won't ask any supplementaries on them. The other type of question is to the Minister about something that might have been said or done by the opposition. Now, questions are only about what the minister has responsibility for. Ministers are not responsible for the opposition parties, not responsible for that, so they cannot ask questions about them. So these are difficult questions to craft. So a member of the opposition might have said something one day about a particular issue. It might have been about corrections of the number of people in prison and how the numbers have gone up. And so someone might ask the Minister of Corrections, can he give us the latest muster numbers for the prisons in New Zealand? The Minister for Corrections will stand by, yes, I can help you, and I've got these are the numbers here. And then we'll slide off and make a comment. These are completely contrary to what the opposition claimed the other day, who had said such and such. Speaker will shut him down at that point because he's not responsible for that, but making the point that they've got this wrong. So they can be an offensive weapon for the government of the day. For the opposition parties, they are about testing people about what they know and about their responsibilities. And they also help form a view about how the government is going. A friend of mine used to said to me, and this was his view on politics, he wasn't really interested in politics, a very smart guy, very intelligent guy, he said, but Rick, look, none of us are interested in politics. We're not interested in Wellington particularly. All we're interested in is the shop is tidy. If the shop's untidy, it's got messy, then all we'll do is vote to throw them out and put a new lot in. That's what we're interested in. Just keep it out of our lives. So keeping the shop tidy is really quite another part of how question time works. So a government can start to sort of fray at the edges and fall apart if it's got too many things which it can't answer accurately. So I'll give you one example is that during the late 90s, the opposition spokesperson, Annie King, on social welfare was hammering the Minister for Social Welfare about the cost of wallpaper for a refurbishment in an MSD building. And the figures that got out were substantial. And this just seemed to be, the cost was huge. And the minister couldn't answer properly what it was. It went on day after day about why should people be this done, and MSD is spending this amount on wallpaper. It was really embarrassing. Anyway, the minister never quite got it right. It was just messy. It wasn't a big thing, but it just seemed messy. The funny part about this, though, is it turns out later that the figure for the wallpaper was per roll, but what was not known at the time, and the minister never made clear because the staff had never told them, was that the wallpaper was for 3 rolls wide. So when we divided it by 3, it wasn't actually an outlandish amount, but no one knew that at the time. So you've got to the minister's got to have good information and make sure they dig to get the thing right. But question time is also really important. I use this example that when George W. Bush was talking about Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction, people were trying to figure out what these things were, where they were, whatever, and it just had these vague reports. But there was no ability for the media or for Congress or for the Senate to interrogate Bush and the executive on this. And I contrast that with what would happen if it was in New Zealand. So if in New Zealand, the Prime Minister of the day was contemplating going to war in Iraq because there was suggestion of weapons of mass destruction, the opposition members every day, 3 days a week, for weeks on end, could ask the Prime Minister, what evidence do they have? What have they got this? And narrow in on this and put the heat on. So the cameras are there, the media's there, everybody's there. And under the searing, intense light of this inquiry, you have to come up with the answers. And I would have thought in this particular case, the war on Iraq would never have taken place. Question time has changed over the years. When I first went to Parliament, it was 12 questions and it was a set time. And there was a set number of supplementary questions, 2 to each question. And when the time came, the chopper came down, that was it. So the government would muck around and other things, slow the process down because there's less questions. So with the transfer to MMP after the referendum in 1996, the new system came in, and questions were then for, instead of just being allocated, government and opposition, proportionally, so in proportion to the number of members that people have. They then have decided to allocate supplementary questions in proportion to the parties, and to have a set number of questions which have to be asked and answered regardless. So we've got that. And the other great shift was off the cuff by Jonathan Hunt. I don't know why he did that, but Rod Donald strode down the House one day and said to Jonathan when he's in the chair, look, we don't want to have our supplementary questions on this. Can we take our supplementary questions on that particular topic which are not interested in and transfer them to one which we are? And Jonathan said, sure, and then simply announced that. I was in the Whip's chair at the time, and I sent a note off to Jonathan, you've now made question time, not question time, but interrogation time. He just simply ignored it, but that's what it's become. So when a minister's got a question to them, they're not sure how many supplementaries are going to be asked. So there's uncertainty, so you've got to be even more on your mettle. If I just explain question time, how it arrives, that on the day of the Parliament sitting, at 2 o'clock there's going to be the prayer, and then there's going to be questions to ministers shortly thereafter. So opposition parties and government parties have until 10 o'clock to submit their questions to the clerk. So they sit down and figure out what they're going to ask the questions of that day. At 10 o'clock, they're at the clerk's office. And shortly thereafter, the clerk distributes the questions to the parties. And then from then until 2 o'clock, you've got to find out the answers. So some of them you can't. For example, the classic question to Helen Clark was, do you have confidence in all of your ministers? And Helen would send a note out to people saying, of course. The answer was, of course I do, but if there's something I need to know, I'll be in my office on the 9th floor at 12 o'clock. And this was following the rule that the leader cannot be surprised. Her view, and I agree with it, was that you can't defend something if you are unaware of it. You can't defend the indefensible, of course, but you can manage things, and you can only manage things if you know what it is. I always wanted to be standing at the queue, standing outside the door to see the queue as they went in to see the PM at 12 o'clock a PM. I don't think I've been smart today. So whatever it was, anyway, you would have that, and from that, the question could then bounce off to a particular minister they thought was particularly weak. So that was that one. So you can ask a question which is direct to the Minister of Transport, bang, 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 and you get the answer straight away from that. But quite often the questioner will want to keep their hand undisclosed. So they will ask a vague question at the beginning, knowing to have a pointed line of questions to follow that. From a minister's point of view, you need to have the answers. And as I've given the thing about the wallpaper, had the fact that the wallpaper was 3 rolls wide become known, the issue would have sort of died somewhat. So you have to know, you have to get the information. And the staff who provide you with this information aren't always aware of how the system works. So it worked best for me when I had my staff come to Wellington for a day, and we went through question times. I saw how questions were generated. I saw the preparation of this, and went to question time afterwards. And at the end of that, there was one of the staff who was in his 50s said, that was the best day's education I've ever had in my life. I just loved it. And the material I got after that was absolutely spot on. So they knew what it was. The question meant, and I'd dig up the answers for it. Oh, by the way, you might need to be aware of this, you might need to be aware of that, you might need to be aware of the other. So all the supplementary stuff poured in, so you're well briefed. That's how it should work. We'll just see how this new crop of ministers go, because it is actually a very tough job to be there and have the question come out and be ready for any question that comes after that. There have been some people who have been masters at just defending things. I mean, one of the great answers was from John Tamahiri. From Simon Power, asked him what has he done for such and such small business in the time he's been in charge of the portfolio. And Tamahiri stood up and said, heaps, and sat down. Simon Power was like, what's that answer? And the Speaker said, well, it was an answer. It was direct. It was very clear. You might want to ask some more supplementary questions. By this stage, Simon Power was a bit befuddled as to what he was going to ask. The other one was, another classic was Lockwood Smith to Parakura Horomir about something. And he had been hammering away at Parakura one day. Anyway, so he asked a question about Parakura, about such and such, and Parakura gave the answer. And Lockwood stood up and said, but Minister, how do you explain this in your letter dated such and such? Blah, 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 read it out. And Parakura stood up, oh, that was a pre-letter, and sat down. Lockwood was like, pre-letter? What's a pre-letter? He didn't. And the Speaker again ruled, well, he did answer the question. So he gave the answer. Which then brings me on to my other point about question time. Question time I've always looked at as a metaphor for question time is cricket, where the minister is the batter and the questioner is the bowler. And so you have bowled questions that come in a very gentle, drop in, short, float up, and the batter can hit them away anyway. And these are just to sort of delude you, because as these come along, in the middle of this somewhere will become a fast, short, dug-in, ripping up ball to rear itself ugly. Others will be ones which will just gently bouncing like googlies, move away, drift off. So people write their questions in a way of entrapping the batsman, entrapping and I've seen this done brilliantly on occasions where the question just led the person on all the way until the final question came in and there was no answer. It laid all the ground for it. It was just skittled, clean bowl. So it's if you get the metaphor in your head, you have in your mind that this is one of the rights of a member of Parliament is to ask questions. And the other thing that's really important about it is holding the executive of the government to account. So every day they have to account for what they've done and answer. And they cannot give an answer which is directly wrong. If it is proven that it's a factual answer and have given a factually incorrect answer, they can be off the Privileges Committee and heavily censored. So if there's a mistake in a question, the minister realises the mistake, the first thing to do is come down to the House, take a point of order and say, I've got a correction to make as soon as you know. Can't sit on it for days, you have to do it as soon as you know. So there's a lot of integrity in the system. It doesn't always mean that people aren't there to mislead to a degree. Not always going to lead you directly to the answers. One person wittily said to me one day that question time wasn't about providing information, Rick. Oh, all right, okay. It's not about providing. So what are we here for? It's about politics. Right. So it's about creating the impression and so on. But it is a fabulous institution. It's a theatre and it's got great sport in it and some wonderful humour. I remember when Bill Birch was the Minister of Finance and Winston Peters was the Treasurer, and Jeanette Fitzsimons was hammering the Minister for Transport about open skies policy and how many there'll be open skies, will be planes flying backwards and forwards with no people in empty seats. And anyway, so as Cullen stood up, he said, speaking of bums on seats, my question is to the Treasurer. Those of us who heard it just fell over, but Winston heard it, but he didn't go and take a point of order about it because it then just highlight the question. Just let it slide on by. So there's all these little wee jibes go backwards and forwards, and you just have to watch it as an intellectual game of wits. An intellectual game which is about delivery and about style and how things are created, But fundamentally, it's about holding the executive to account, and it is the toughest question time in the world, in my view. Prime Minister's question time in England is highly rated, but the questions have to be in 7 days before. A lot of things can happen in 7 days. You can't ask them straight off the cuff. In New Zealand, that day at 10 o'clock that day. In Australia, the questions get a very limited time to question, and there's great speeches which follow. In New Zealand, there's no speech. It has to be a short, succinct answer. And in New Zealand, there's greater flexibility about the number of supplementaries can be shifted around. It's become an interrogation system. It is it's the toughest system of holding the executive account I've ever seen. And I credit to all the ministers and everybody who participates. It's not easy, and I respect everybody's efforts in that. But it is a place where people who can't do it will be found out.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of points of clarification. When the clerk gets the questions at 10 a.m,
Yep.
do the standing orders allow them to reject certain questions?
Sure.
Accept certain questions? What are the rules around that?
Well, the rules around that is that they have to be, there's several rules about it. Of course, the language has to be temperate. They have to be within the minister's responsibility. So you can't ask, minister, you can't ask a personal question, what did the minister do on the weekend?
Yeah, right.
So the clerk throw all of them out. There's certain rules about it, and the clerk will reject them. And if the clerk's office feel they're not clear about something, we should say, well, you haven't got the. Would you want it? Do you mean here? Do that to help sharpen them up so there's clarity about what it is. So, but at the end. The clerk actually is a really important constitutional figure. The clerk makes sure that the bills being in the House are correct. Unlike America, we can add any amendment you like into a bill. You can't in New Zealand. You put them up, the clerk rejects them. So that's it. There's no appeal. His ruling is final and binding. That's it. You can have a row with the clerk at the business committee later, but the clerk's view holds. So they have a really powerful position in and they're making sure that the questions are on point, that the questions are for ministerial responsibility. But what the clerk can't control is where the question goes. So the question can be reallocated by the government, and that's consistent with this collective responsibility of cabinet. So some people might put a question up to the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister might just lay that off to the Minister responsible for the portfolio, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And any objections to that would be litigated through the Speaker rather than the clerk?
Oh, the Speaker, but again, the Speaker would just say that it's the government's responsibility to allocate the questions. Right. So people raise it as a point of order just to highlight the fact that it's gone. It's just to try and score a political point. But you know you're going to lose every time.
Right, okay.
So it's one of those things that you do just because you know you're going to lose it. The Prime Minister doesn't want to answer this question. This kind of thing.
Right.
So it's
ultimately it's their call.
Ultimately, absolutely.
Right.
Sometimes if a person, the minister's under pressure, they might not attend question time, and it'll be allocated to someone else. And someone goes, why hasn't it got to the minister? And the rule is you're not allowed to identify the absence of a member from the House. So you fall foul of that, and you fall foul of the other rule is that the question can be. But people do raise it just to highlight the point with me, to sort of score a point.
How do ministerial colleagues feel about no-shows from other ministers?
Well, people can only leave the House with the permission of the whip. So it's not an executive decision. It's not a cabinet decision. It's a whip's decision. Who's here and who's out.
I don't think people would understand that intuitively. So let's expand on that. What you're saying is, if a minister who's part of the executive says, "I don't want to go to question time today," that is, he or she can't unilaterally decide not to show up. They need to get permission from the whip. No,
not quite. No, they can't. They have to be in the building. So to leave the building, leave the precinct of Parliament, they need the permission of the whip.
Right.
So you can't. So they can be in the building, But if they don't feel quite up to it, they would talk to the PM and the Leader of the House and say, look, I'm just not up to this today. If they said, look, I'm not up to this today, the Leader of the House would sort of reallocate the question for them. I'm sure of that. They look after each other. You don't want to put someone in a position where they're under pressure and they're not feeling like they can cope with it. So they'll do what they're best to shelter them. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen.
But there is an expectation that you show up.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, you have to. If you're not going to front for your job, your portfolio, why are you there?
Right.
This is. It's like.
So it's taken very seriously.
Very seriously. Oh yes. No question about that. And if someone's struggling with questions, well then there are a group of people who come around them and sort of give them help and coaching about this and work out some good answers for them, some other lines for them to how to handle this. You've got to be able to do the job. Fronting for question time is part of your ministerial responsibilities. It's part of why you get paid, and you just have to do it.
One basic process question, just to cover it off. Opposition parties, how do they decide what to ask, when to ask it, who asks it, and finalises the draft of the language?
Well, Labor, and I think National Party is the same, has a procedures meeting. And it's a meeting starts usually about 9 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 8:30, and they go through the what's on the agenda for the day. And one of the key things of that meeting will be questions for the day. So the Leader of the House or the Leader of the House for each party will chair that meeting, and they'll have bids for questions. So people turn up, I've got a question, this question, that, and they'll work out what their priorities are, work out what they think is best for them in the longer term. So do they have a long-term strategy? Are we targeting these ministers on these portfolios for these issues? And if they are, then the questions will, they'll have priority over other questions. Then a question might come up, which is, there's something's happened, which is of public interest, so that might then get moved in. There might be an opportunity for a local person who's got a local issue comes up that's really important, like, I don't know, fires in Christchurch at the moment. They'd probably be surprised if someone doesn't ask questions about the fires, but civil defence response and fire response. And those will be asked by local members of Parliament rather than the spokesperson for the policy areas. So there's a mixture of things to that. And then it works out how many supplementaries each. So the questions which are more important will get more supplementaries than the ones which are less important. So allocate all them. So it's a conscious process. And in conjunction with this, there's also every Wednesday is Members' Day. So if someone has an issue they want to raise by way of questions and they don't get a question that day, the Leader of the House or the team might say, well, we'll give you 5 minutes on Members' Day, and you can have a say on that. And there's other ways in which you can express this. The Parliament is highly structured. It starts at 2 o'clock. It's almost like the chain on the freezing works that starts at 6 in the morning. 6 o'clock, the hooter goes, boof, the chain moves. And for this, it's the prayer, and it starts, and everything moves after that. And then there's the order paper, which has been through the Leader of the House, sets the order paper for the day. It decides which bills are going to be heard. The procedures meeting for both government and opposition parties will set who's going to speak on what, get the speakers, you're speaking on this and you're speaking on that. People then the office will work out what they're going to say and where they go from there. But there's not a lot of opportunity for individual MPs to raise things for themselves. So you've got to find it by way of question time. You can find it by way of 5-minute speeches on Members' Day. But also MPs can ask what we call written questions. So members can ask written questions and they have to be answered within a limited number of days. I can't quite remember the number, it's 3 or 5 days, but written questions. And if you go through this, they're published is all these written questions, thousands of them now, written questions, and then there's a whole bureaucracy around the back there getting information to answer the written questions. So the minister has to sign off for the answer for each written question. So every question comes in, there's an answer provided. The minister has to check to see that they're comfortable with it, and then sign it off before it goes into the system. And then that too is published. For each of the ministerial portfolios, there will be a select committee which they'll be allocated to, and they'll have to come in for their annual reviews, and the departments and ministries will have to put up their annual reports and what they've spent the money on, the plans for this, and they'll be carefully going over it. So it'll go through the specific select committees. And then it's also, they'll be subject to some scrutiny by the Finance and Expenditure Committee. One of the other great strengths of the New Zealand Parliament is the Office of the Auditor General. This is Parliament's auditor. So the executive have, within each of the departments, will have their own audit and their own sets of accounts, and they'll write them up as they want. But in New Zealand, we have this Office of Auditor General, and it is an officer of Parliament, and they're there to scrutinise each of the department's accounts for the interests of Parliament and the taxpayer. And they have got incredible power. You cannot withhold any information from them. They've got a team of very able people who take the job seriously. They rummage through everything like you've never seen before. They're like a customs rummage squad in a way. When they decide to come along and have a go at a department of thorough, it's a rummage. They rumble through everything. And they go down to the minutiae, the finest detail, to make sure things are right. And the Office of the Auditor General also does local government as well. So powerful institution, well led, lots of able staff, and they're committed. And they then go through each of the department's accounts as well. So it's a pretty thorough system.
Right. The select committee composition, is that determined by non-executive
Yes.
membership as well?
Yes. So
does that mean that select committees have majority opposition?
They get very close. Some select committees have majority opposition, and they'll have majority chairs. Opposition chairs. So the government of the day then has to figure out what it is that's most important to them. So how many they put on a select committee, because there's only so many spots. How many they put on a select committee? So they might choose to put their, as they normally do, their numbers to get the majority for the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee. You wouldn't want that to get out of control. But there's others that they're less worried about. So they'll have. So that's been an interesting point of view. And interestingly, members, when they're on select committees, it is quite a different atmosphere from the House, and it's much more of we here as a select committee. The best at it actually is the agricultural people, the primary production. It's like a little club with them. They are primary producers who are really interested in that. There's almost no party politics in it, and the thing that. Again, what New Zealand has, which I think is a strength, has this a selection of standing select committees. And the standing select committee has quite a lot of follow-on from people who have continuity from members of Parliament, continuity of staff supporting them, continuity, and so it builds up a body of knowledge, a body of contacts. And there's groups of people who are in agencies who are interested in a particular subject. You take, for example, health, then they will have, the Health Select Committee will have, and the staff will have contacts with lots of different people who've been involved with them before, mailing lists, email lists, and if an issue comes up in a hurry, they want to have some feedback about it, they've got all the contacts. Yeah. They don't have to staff themselves. They've got relationships, We need to know this. Could you provide us information on that? Could you provide that?
It's not combat, is it?
No, it's not combat, no. And the great thing about it too is that I don't think there's ever been a bill which has gone from the House to the Select Committee that hasn't come back with significant changes.
Right. So it functions. It's a functioning mechanism.
Yeah. Before, under the old first past the post system, the select committee was basically owned by the minister.
Right.
Responsible. So that they would have their person as the chair, they would have the majority, and that was it. The select committees were kind of, almost with part of the minister's fiefdom.
Yeah.
But that's not the case today.
That's interesting. So that's changed.
Has changed significantly.
Time.
Yeah, it changed significantly. There would be, prior to, when under the old first past the post system, the minister would ring up the chair and tell them what they wanted, and then the chair would tell their things, and that's what would happen. That was it. But they've got no control over that now. So you have to negotiate. That's the beauty of the New Zealand Parliament, is this MMP system. You have to negotiate on all levels. You can't. There's no guarantees here. So the party has to get 61 votes, and people have to say, "Well, I willingly give you our votes and support, and I'll stand to be criticised if in the event we got wrong." So it's a considered decision. Nobody's locked in here.
Yeah, and it doesn't. You can't sign just the one coalition deal and then select committees operate like fiefdoms.
No.
The select committees still retain their own sense of identity and purpose, separate and apart from the top line alliance that they might have formed to make the government.
Yes, and I think, and Geoffrey Palmer put it, he said that under this new MMP system, New Zealand's going to be something like Westminster. Somewhere between Washington and Westminster. And I think that's been a very fair analysis. So the point is that we would have had, I'm sure there's lots of pieces in our legislation which have been put in there unnecessarily.
Yeah.
But today you have to convince people that it's there. So the stuff there is, in my view, much more substantive.
Because you have to negotiate bill by bill, issue by issue, crisis by crisis. You can't just flip the switch and go, well, we've got the numbers.
That's right.
So buggy, which is the Bill Birch sort of...
That's exactly right.
Well, yeah.
So I think this is a great strength, but it's not one which is really understood. So
it's in negative space.
That's right. In negative space, that's exactly right. So I think it's one's great strengths.